what is a modal? You probably all see, we all know what it means. So I want to make sure we all are on the same page. So a modal is essentially just an alert grown up. A modal requires a user response. So we just can't dismiss it. We actually have to interact with it. We have to have a dialogue or a conversation with this particular element. So as we are setting it up, we want to think about the state that we carry that through. So the initial state is going to be our persistent state, or our, our initial state, and what elements we want to have on here throughout as we are doing this. So one thing that you might think would be fine is the HTML5 tag dialogue on. That would make sense, but no, we can't use that. Unfortunately, screen readers specifically aren't yet there with the technology. So if you use dialogue, you're going to also have to use a div along with it, to the point where it's almost unnecessary. We'll just toss it out and not add some extra code. So we're going to add role dialogue instead when we're going to create the modal. There is a time and a place to use alert dialogue, but that's typically when you're alerting something. Notification. When you're requiring a login form or something like that, pretty much anything that we have for a modal, that's when we want dialogue. Now we have two different options that we could use. Typically this isn't necessary. We have assertive and polite. If we are just creating a straight HTML, JavaScript, CSS kind of a modal, that's unnecessary. That's already taken care of with the code that we're going to add. However, when you're using Angular, when you're using React, those single page applications, that's where you really need to pay attention to focus, and also make sure that those screen readers understand that there's going to be something that happens. So in React and Angular, this is important. You want to have either assertive or polite. I have polite a little bit larger because typically we don't want to interrupt the user. We don't want to say, hey, pay attention to me. So that's what we're doing if we say assertive. We're just yelling at that user and screaming at them, which, again, if it's an alert, fine. But the regular modal, we just want to have that polite. We want to have the user be able to find that naturally on their own. So these, now we're getting into WAI ARIA. We don't need to know why ARIA, but these are essentially attributes that are going to help us with assistive technology. That's really all you need to know about WAI ARIA. These are specific for the modal. These will appear all in other various different kinds of places as well. As I said, this is boss level accessibility. So, we specifically with the modal, we want to ensure that we label it a dialogue. As I said, we want to let folks know that it's an alert. We're notifying them that we want to have this UI conversation. ARIA labeled by, this is just a way to say this modal is this. So we can see visually where a title is. When somebody's using assistive technology, they're going to need some help. They're going to need that described to them. Using ARIA labeled by is how we tell screen readers and other assistive technology, this is the main title of our modal. ARIA described by, that's more of a nice to have. That's not crucial, but it does help screen readers digest the rest of the content that is in the modal. So these are both specific attributes that you can kind of see in right up in here that we have the IDs. I can't somehow get the mouse pointer at this point there. ARIA labeled by and ARIA described by both require ID. Not use classes, you must use ID when you're using these attributes. So just keep that in mind. So specifically with the ARIA labeled by in my example, you can see that I am pointing to the title. So, that's pretty obvious. I'm pointing to the title of this modal. And the ARIA described by, that is the body content that I have in here. Right now, my ID is content. So that way the screen reader, after reading off the title, it knows to read off everything else that is in the modal. ARIA modal equals true. Again, this is just another thing that's going to help out assistive technology, screen readers, and anything else that's going to digest it. It's just a way to signify that this is indeed a modal. Yet another nice to have, not a requirement, but it'll kind of ease the process there. Some issues that you might encounter later with accessibility are really more easily solved if you just throw in this ARIA modal equals true. Make sure you put that specifically on the modal container. Where else? ARIA label It seems maybe obvious. We might not necessarily think about a close button as being a big deal, but a close button really, at its core, is just a button that says close. Obviously, our designers, our UX folks, they probably don't want a button that's ugly and says close. So in order to get that X on the upper right-hand corner, firstly, just kidding about semantics, we usually want everything with accessibility to be semantic. We want to keep the user experience uniform, and we don't want to have surprises. The close button is an exception. The close button in a modal is not the most important information in that modal. So we don't want to first just hit them with a close button right away. Instead, we want to hit them with the title, with the information, and we actually want to put that close button semantically at the very end, even though visually that's going to be in the upper, usually in the upper right-hand corner, depending. So just keep that in mind, is that firstly, we're taking that out of our typical semantic structure and also labeling it using ARIA label. So that tells assistive technology that this is actually a close button and not just a random X button that who knows what that does. So moving forward, again, initial state. Our initial state is inactive. It's going to be either the modal is hidden from screen reader, from visual users, from keyboard. We don't want to be able to access the modal when it's inactive. Again, pretty obvious. But one thing here is the difference between display none and visibility hidden. Display none is probably how you're used to hiding elements. However, that does take it completely out of the accessibility tree. And unless you do some fancy JavaScript to make sure it's put back in and make sure that the assistive technology knows that it's back, there's really no way for assistive technology to figure out what's going to happen. So I would just say don't use display none. Instead, use visibility hidden when you're trying to hide anything. And it doesn't matter in this case if it's the modal, if you're trying to hide the body content, anything that you're trying to hide from a screen reader or visually, you want to make sure that you use visibility hidden instead of display none. That's really kind of the nitty-gritty of accessibility that you wouldn't necessarily know. So that's a little gotcha on some of the browsers. So modal, once we activate that modal, once it transitions, we want to make sure it's a trap. We want to make sure that we hold the user there. We want to have that conversation with them. And much like I'm trapping you right here in this room, I don't want you to leave. So I'm going to close the door, I'll lock it. And that's essentially what we want to do with accessibility. We want to close the door, lock it, and keep that user in our modal. So when it comes to that, we want to make sure that we have various different kinds of focus. Firstly, the keyboard focus, that's what I'm thinking of specifically. Keyboard focus is vital when you're tabbing through. It doesn't matter if you're a sighted user or somebody who's impaired. A wide variety of different people use keyboard. Now, if you're a power developer, you're just going to tab through. You're not going to worry about trying to use your mouse, but that's very important to make sure that you're maintaining keyboard focus. That's the biggest thing with modals, and that's the thing that you really want to make sure traps the user. I'll get to that, and I'll get to the attributes specifically that will pertain to keyboard focus, but also to visual focus that can't be ignored. We want to make sure again that we are focusing that user and making sure that they understand what the most important information is and making sure that they pay attention to what we want them to pay attention to. And also screen reader, that does play with the keyboard focus, but there are specific keyboard combinations with a screen reader that you need to make sure still work. We want to make sure that we trap that user there for as long as we want them. But, you know, if they want to use the door to exit, we still want to let them use the door to exit. So the other thing we also need to not forget is where that user came in or where that user entered. That's something that we'll talk about a little bit later, but just kind of keep that in your mind. So when we're talking about the keyboard focus, we want to make sure that we're removing all that focus from our body. We want to make sure that the user's not able to get out to any of the links that were on the page. We don't want to allow that user to tab anywhere within the content. So what we're going to do to make sure that that's hidden, this is some pretty simple CSS. We can throw a mask over there. We have a visual opacity over there, so it dims the content. It really is taking care of our visual focus. In addition to the keyboard focus, I switched the titles. Okay. The keyboard focus, and this should be keyboard focus, we want to make sure that we set tab index -1 and on the body content, usually the main container for the body content. And we also want to use the new HTML5 attribute inert that is essentially duplicating the -1 tab index. But this plays very well with assistive technology. This is kind of a shortcut. This is a great new attribute that only came out within the last year or two. So that if you're choosing to use an array, a JavaScript array, you just render all the body content inert. You just throw that attribute on all of that, and then nobody can access it via screen reader. Nobody can access that via keyboard, and you really can't click anywhere else other than the modal. Again, keyboard focus, that last focused element. So we want to make sure that the user, they entered through something, probably a button to activate it, maybe an alert, maybe they submitted something. So we want to make sure that we know where they came from so we can send them right back when they decide to leave. So that one way to do that is to add some JavaScript to maintain that last focused element. There's a variety of different ways to do that. This is simply one example, but make sure that you retain that. You need to grab that last focused element. If you don't, that modal will close, and then the user has no idea where they are. They don't know if it's transitioned to the page. They don't know if they submitted additional information. So that's very, very important to make sure that you bring the user back to that last focus. I keep talking about focus. So when we're talking about keyboard focus, what is best? Where do you put that keyboard focus? And the question is rather ambiguous. On adventure game, depending on what kind of modal you're actually using. The experts are widely on the spectrum of where they believe focus should go. So we have 4 major elements that, by and large, the experts have come to some kind of consensus. This is where focus should maybe live sometimes. So personally, I would advocate for container focus. So when we're taking a look at the main modal, I have this so we can take a look at the visual. Instead of putting focus anywhere else within the modal, either on the title, on the continue, cancel, whichever, we want that focus programmatically to exist on the actual container. So right now where I have this white border for my modal, that is where the programmatic focus will exist. That's not necessarily going to be a visual focus, so you're not going to see the focus ring, as is typical with focus indicators. And it will not necessarily visually have a big impact, but for a screen reader, what that's going to do is it's going to recognize that modal, it's going to announce that it's a modal, and then it's going to allow that user flexibility and freedom to be able to figure out where they want to go. So you're not dictating to that user where they have to go within the modal. You're allowing them to navigate as they naturally would, as a regular sighted user typically would. So that's one option. It is the more difficult option. So that's why we have some other things that we can work with. Depending on what the modal's purpose is, we might want to alert them to the title. Maybe it's an error message, maybe it's an important announcement. So typically that is something that we'll focus on, especially when there's no form, no interactive elements beyond the button. Title is usually standard. So that is going to be the answer from all of the accessibility experts to Q, Celio, any major experts are going to tell you to put that focus on the title. This, again, will allow the user to navigate however they want to. They'll be able to navigate through the content. It's not going to force them to hear a whole bunch of announcements if they're using a screen reader, and then they can use the keyboard as is typical. The other 2 options, the close button, again, not my preference. As I first mentioned, I don't think the close button is the most important thing in our modal. I don't want to open a modal and just have them, nope, just close that right down. So while it is an option and while it will allow the user to interact with the modal as they would expect, just keep in mind for the best user experience, that might not necessarily be where you want to put that focus. It's the thing to keep in mind, but technically it's accessible. It is fully compliant, it's fully accessible. And then form element. Since the majority of modals that I've come across have some kind of a form interaction thing, inputs, buttons, radio buttons, checkboxes, etc. Typically, first thing that you want to do is put that user's focus on that first form element. So whether that's an input, whether that's a checkbox, you want that focus to go directly to that form element. That way the user, firstly, they still receive all of that notification if they're using a screen reader. They can still navigate wherever they want to if they are using keyboard navigation. And they can still exit and work with the modal as a regular user would expect. So these are various different options. All of them are correct. It's just a matter of what you are going to use within your modal. So just to kind of walk through that with this display, again, the options, the main one would be the main container, the white border focus, that's the title. So I could have focus, and that would have a focus indicator if we chose to have that as our first focus element. And then I would say the next focus element for me, in my mind, if I was going to choose this, I would choose to have focus on the continue button because I want them to continue my app, and exiting out. And of course, that red button and the cancel, those both are viable options for being the first focus. Cancel less so because semantically that comes second of the form elements, and that button, as I told you, I'm not a fan. And I mentioned earlier the keyboard combinations, right? I keep kind of talking about the keyboard, specifically tab. That's obviously what most of us, if you're using a keyboard navigation, that's what you're accustomed to using. So we want to make sure that that is going to be readily used, and we're going to use that tab key you expect. The rest of these keyboard combinations, those are maybe something you wouldn't necessarily think of unless you're working with assistive technology. So you need to make sure that the user can use the escape button to get out of that modal. It's crucial, it's vital. Take nothing else away from the slide, you must have that escape button working. So that's just a little bit of JavaScript that you would add in there. F6 is just to know about. That's not something that you'd have to program for unless you're really building some kind of complex interactive application where you're overwriting a lot of the keyboard combinations. F6 specifically will take your browser and put it right back up into the URL field. So then the user would be able to type in a different website or something like that. So although we do want to trap our user in our modal, we don't want to trap them in the browser forever and ever. They can never escape. So we want to make sure that those, F6 works just as they would ordinarily expect that to work. The spacebar, that typically activates buttons. You can use input elements, so we want to make sure that the spacebar is continuing to work as expected. That is crucial when we're talking about using screen readers. Oftentimes the spacebar or enter is how they're going to navigate using buttons and other various different kinds of interactive elements. So those are just some things to kind of keep in mind when we're thinking about keyboard combos, making sure that these are still used as we would typically expect them to be used. So escape, again, we need to manage the focus here. So we have the active state of our modal. We have taken away focus from our main content, and we have focus on our modal, but what do we do when they're trying to leave? Again, we want to make sure that we put them right back at that element that triggered the modal, and we want to make sure that everything we added is now taken. Boy, today's day, isn't it? Huh. I promise there's some more here. Oh, well. There was more, but burned through that really quickly. The emergencies and being nervous and all. So I know that you guys had some panel discussion earlier. I know that I have a lot of information that I probably skipped over. So I want to open it up to questions. Okay? Yes. Off the top of my head, it's we usually call it LI-CHI, but Chicago Digital Accessibility. That is a great question. I mean, Chicago Accessibility Meetup will get you there, and I don't have an internet connection. Really knocking it out of the park today. Yeah.
Quick exit buttons from sites. Are there any best practices for those? Or like the escape button made me think about that. So like implementing a quick exit on your site to like quickly navigate a user away, like if they're in a person, get off of your site real quick.
Oh, that's
if they're like looking at how should something like that play with, like we were thinking about using the escape button for that, but then like that hijack like the regular experience of escape button?
Would indeed hijack the regular experience, so you would need to manage that and kind of be cognizant of why you're doing that, and a way to mitigate that anytime you're trying to overwrite native behavior is to have an alert. Just an alert that this is going to immediately close it. So that would be up to you to determine if that's immediate enough to have the alert trigger first, and then for the page or the app to completely just go away. Question. I would totally have these slides available after this presentation. Any other questions?
How did you get?
Oh, cool. How did I get in accessibility? That's a good question. I was the tech support person at Northwestern University, and nobody else wanted to do it. So they were like, hey, Santina, you're up. I was literally the junior most person there, and we had an incoming freshman who was completely blind. He's a skateboarder, which is really cool. Yeah. So when you talk about getting empathy, meeting somebody who is fully blind and also skateboarding, and then telling him that, sorry, our website isn't accessible, that's not really an excuse. So, it was foisted upon me a long time ago, but I'm appreciative that it was, because now here I am. Good. Oh, yeah. Sure, absolutely, yeah. There's a wide variety of different ways there you can approach it from a capitalistic point of view. It surely will increase revenue. There's certainly statistics around that are, I don't have them available right now. So, when you're talking to the higher ups, that's usually where it hits them the most, is when you start to talk about that. Diversity and inclusion, just mentioning that it's firstly the right thing to do, in addition to the law, that helps. But then, emphasizing that there are other major companies that are really focused on accessibility, just kind of pointing to the new Microsoft controller, if you guys have seen that, for an example. Kind of trying to, it does come for a little bit top down to try to get those folks to care about it. But once you get that one person to kind of latch on, whether that's explaining why this is necessary, the various different kinds of abilities. There's a wide variety of ways to approach that could probably be its own presentation. Any other?
Anything that you would recommend out of your?
Sure. Yeah. That's a great question. That is. When we think about Toolbox and we think about various different kinds of things for accessibility, there are libraries specific for modals that have been written. So any kind of language that you're working in, specifically I am working in React, so that is one thing that's in my toolkit that's super specific and super developer focused. I'm not quite sure if you're looking for some other design focused things. There's a wide variety of color contrast checkers and those kinds of different things. It's not a one-stop shop. It's kind of like a patchwork, put it all together kind of a situation. But definitely 18F has a great resource. The main co-org of the accessibility meetup is the lead for that. So there's a library readily available at 18F. Trying to think of some other specific resources, but I would definitely, I mean, I'm biased since he's here in Chicago and since he's working on 18F, so I would encourage you to check that out. Any other? Ooh, I feel like I really turboed through that.